This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Pinewood, North Carolina, was the kind of town where the wind had a voice. It whispered through the towering pines, the crumbling stone fences, the cracked sidewalks, echoing old secrets long buried beneath the surface of a seemingly perfect community. The town hadn't changed in decades, and those who lived there prided themselves on its unwavering tranquility. Pinewood was a place where nothing bad ever happened, or so the townsfolk liked to think. It sat nestled against the edge of the Appalachian foothills, the dense forest surrounding it like a dark veil, hiding it from the outside world. The houses were small but well kept, their lawns manicured to the point of obsession, each one a perfect replica of its neighbor. The roads were empty most of the time, save for the occasional rusted truck or the clatter of a bicycle against the pavement. At night, the streets were quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that made it impossible to shake the sense that something was wrong, though nobody could ever put their finger on it. In Pinewood, it was easy to believe that nothing could disturb the stillness, the uniformity. Even the people who lived there had a certain hollow quality to them, like actors in a play who'd long forgotten their lines, their movements stiff and rehearsed. They smiled at each other with practiced ease, exchanged pleasantries at the grocery store. The town had always been this way, conservative, insular, a place where newcomers were viewed with suspicion, where differences were ignored, and where everyone had learned to keep their heads down. It was a town where the worst you could expect was a minor traffic accident, or a small-town scandal that would eventually fade into the past. But then, one day, 3 girls arrived. Their names were Jasmine, Zuri, and Talia. They were not from Pinewood. They didn't belong here. The first time the town saw them, it was as though the air had thickened. They were unlike anyone the town's people had ever known. Too dark, too loud, too foreign. Their clothes were always too extravagant for a town like this, their hair braided in intricate patterns that seemed to belong to a place far away. Their voices tinged with accents that carried hints of places no one in Pinewood had ever visited. They were outcasts, even before anyone had the chance to judge them. At first, the townspeople didn't know what to make of them. They were girls who didn't fit in, and that was a dangerous thing in a town like Pinewood. People talked. Not in the open, of course, but behind closed doors, in hushed tones and sidelong glances. There were rumors, mostly. People whispered about how Jasmine's father was in jail for reasons no one cared to understand, how Zuri's life was a chain of foster homes and broken promises, how Talia's mother had died under mysterious circumstances when she was just a child. No one knew the truth, but the stories were more than enough to stain their reputations in the eyes of the town. Jasmine had dark eyes that gleamed with something unsettling, something like hunger, but no one could name it. She moved through the halls of Pinewood High like a shadow, silent, calculating. Her smile was rare, and when it did appear, it was brief and strange, as though it was more of a grimace than an expression of joy. The girls she passed in the halls avoided her gaze, though they didn't know why. Zuri, with her bright, defiant eyes and a crooked smirk that never quite seemed to reach her face, was more outwardly rebellious. She'd wear torn jackets and black lipstick, skipping class with a swagger that made teachers uncomfortable. She was never afraid to speak her mind, though no one had ever asked for her opinion. Talia, the youngest of the 3, was the quietest. She never spoke unless she had to, her gaze far away, as if she was always thinking of something else. People said she had the air of a girl who had seen things no one should have to see. In the beginning, they kept to themselves. They didn't seek out friends, and no one sought them out. Pinewood had a way of isolating those who didn't fit in. The cliques were tight, the social order rigid. But the girls were different. They didn't seem to care. They sat together at lunch, talking in low voices, their words always soft and private. No one ever understood them, not really, but that didn't matter to the girls. They had their own world, a secret world that no one else could enter, and they were content to leave it that way. As days bled into weeks and weeks bled into months, Pinewood started to change, though no one could point to the moment it began. It was subtle at first, small things. A light left on all night in an abandoned house. A neighbor's cat gone missing, its collar found near the woods. An unsettling sense that someone, somewhere, was watching you. At first, people shrugged it off. They were just coincidences, nothing more. But as the strange occurrences piled up, the town began to feel different. The air had an edge to it now, sharp and electric, like the calm before a storm. No one knew it yet, but this was the beginning of the end. Pinewood's facade of peace was about to crack open, and the darkness lurking beneath would come spilling out in ways no one could have imagined. It wasn't until the first death that the town realized something was wrong. The body was found in the woods behind the elementary school, a place that had always been sacred and untouched. The victim was an older man, a local handyman who was known for his kindness, an innocent soul in the eyes of the townspeople. His death was brutal, though, and the way his body was left behind, discarded like garbage, felt wrong. It wasn't just the violence of the act. It was the way it was done, the coldness, the precision. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was something more calculated, more deliberate. The police investigated, but there were no leads, no suspects, no clues. The town continued to move forward, pretending that it hadn't noticed the darkness creeping in. But the unease lingered, clinging to Pinewood like the smell of something rotting just out of sight. The girls? They seemed unaffected. They went about their lives as though nothing had changed. They still sat together at lunch, still walked the halls with their heads held high, still moved through the town like ghosts. No one could understand how they could be so indifferent, how they could live in the midst of all this horror and remain so calm. But it wasn't until later that the town would realize the truth. The girls weren't unaffected by the death. They were the ones who had caused it. Pinewood had always believed it was safe. It had always prided itself on its simplicity, its quiet existence. But now, that silence began to feel like a trap, and the cracks in the facade were starting to show. And as the town slept, unaware of the storm building just beyond its borders, the girls waited. They were ready to make their mark. Jasmine, Zuri, and Talia had never known anything that resembled a normal childhood. They were bound together by a darkness far deeper than the shadow of the town they had come to inhabit. The town of Pinewood, for all its pristine lawns and quiet streets, was nothing more than a stage, a backdrop for the haunting stories of their lives. Their histories, like the thorns of a twisted vine, had woven them together in ways no one could understand, least of all the people who lived in the town. They were three girls, three souls broken by the world long before they arrived in Pinewood, each carrying the weight of a past that would never let them go. Jasmine was the oldest, a girl with a broken smile and eyes too old for her years. She had been born into a home where love was a foreign concept, a place where violence had always lingered just behind the door. Her father, a man whose temper was as volatile as a thunderstorm, had never known how to love. He had tried, at least in his own twisted way, but his love was the kind that bruised, that scarred, that twisted innocence into something dark. Jasmine's mother, an empty shell of a woman, had never stood up to him. She had been swallowed whole by the same darkness, her eyes distant and hollow, as if she had long since given up on any hope of escape. The house was always cold, even in the summer, and Jasmine had learned early on that silence was the safest way to survive. By the time she was 10, she had already learned how to hide, how to stay out of the way. When her father's anger flared, she would retreat into the dark corners of the house, burying herself in the quiet. There, in the silence, she would close her eyes and imagine another life, one far away from the constant screaming, the shattering of glass, the broken furniture. Her world was one of whispers and shadows, a place where fear had taken root deep within her, growing stronger with every passing day. It wasn't until she was 13 that the violence escalated. Her father's rage, once a fleeting storm, became a constant, and when it came, it was brutal. The worst of it came one cold winter night when Jasmine's father lost control entirely. He had been drinking, too much as always, and her mother had done nothing to stop it. Jasmine had been forced to watch as her father tore into her mother, the sounds of the blows reverberating through the house like gunshots. The horror of it was too much to bear, but there was nothing she could do. She was just a child trapped in a nightmare of her father's making. Her tribe was made to visit the house later that afternoon to reach out to Jasmine. That night, her mother's body lay still, lifeless, blood staining the carpet. Jasmine was left alone, the weight of the violence crashing down on her. And in that moment, she swore that she would never let anyone hurt her again. Not the way her father had hurt her, not the way he had hurt her mother. But even as the years passed and her life moved forward, the scars remained, both the ones visible and those hidden deep within her. Zuri, the second girl, had a past that was no less horrific, though it was different in its own way. Zuri had been born into a system that was supposed to protect her, but it had failed her at every turn. Her earliest memories were of cold foster homes and empty faces. She had been shuffled from one house to another, a child without roots, a girl who had learned not to get too attached, because she was always one step away from being discarded. Each foster home was a new nightmare, filled with new strangers, new rules, and new betrayals. Zuri had learned quickly that affection was nothing more than a fleeting illusion, given freely only to be ripped away in the blink of an eye. She had learned how to survive on her own, how to make herself small when she needed to, how to keep her head down and keep moving. There were moments, small glimpses of love that Zuri would cling to for a while, only to have them ripped away again. In one home, she had found comfort in a woman who promised her safety, a woman who, for a short time, made her believe in the possibility of home. But the woman's kindness had been conditional, extremely conditional. Zuri's rebellious streak, her refusal to be controlled, had been too much for the woman to handle. Her courtesy had been too much for the woman to handle. One night, when Zuri had made a mistake, nothing more than a minor infraction, she had been locked in the basement for hours, the darkness suffocating her, the silence louder than any punishment. It was in that basement, in that endless black, that Zuri had begun to understand that love was not real, and the world was a place where power was all that mattered. And so, she learned to be hard, to be cold, to cut people out of her life before they could hurt her. But that didn't stop the rage from building inside her, the need to lash out, to destroy. By the time she was 16, Zuri had grown accustomed to anger, to the feeling of violence simmering beneath her skin. It became a companion, a thing she could never shake. She didn't know where the rage came from. It was just there, in every breath she took. She had learned to use it, to channel it, to hide it behind her defiant smile and the reckless bravado that kept everyone at a distance. But when the time came, when she finally found herself with the other two girls, she knew that her anger would no longer be something to hide. It would be something to embrace. Talia, the youngest of them, had always been different. Talia's story was the most enigmatic of them all, wrapped in mystery and unspoken horrors. She had been born into a life of privilege, or so it seemed at first. Her mother had been a beautiful woman, well-liked in their small town, married to a man with money and influence. Talia had been the perfect child, quiet, obedient, loved by all. But nothing in her life had been what it seemed. Her mother's love had always felt distant, conditional, as though Talia was just another object to be admired, not a person to be understood. Her father, a man who wore his power like a crown, had no patience for a daughter who refused to play by the rules. He had been a cruel man, a man who treated his family like an extension of his wealth, a thing to be controlled. But the true horror of Talia's life came one evening when she was just 11. Her mother, a woman who had long since lost any semblance of strength, had died under mysterious circumstances. The doctors had said it was an accident, that her mother's heart had failed. But Talia had known better. Her mother had been poisoned. She had been killed slowly, deliberately, by someone she trusted. Talia had discovered the truth too late. Her mother's face, pale and ashen, had shown the signs of the poisoning long before anyone else noticed. But by the time the truth came to light, her mother was already gone. The pain of losing her mother was unbearable, but the cruelty of the death was worse. Talia's father, stone-faced and unemotional, had barely acknowledged the loss, as if it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his life. The realization that her mother had been murdered, that no one had cared enough to protect her, broke something inside Talia. It twisted her mind, filling her with a thirst for revenge, a need to make those who had wronged her feel the same pain she had felt. And so, she became a ghost, moving through the world with cold eyes, never speaking of the horrors she had witnessed. Her mind became a maze of broken thoughts, of unanswered questions, of memories too painful to relive. She had learned to bury her emotions, to pretend they didn't exist, but they were there, always there, like a wound that never healed. Jasmine, Zuri, and Talia had all suffered in different ways, but their pain had fused them together. They had found each other in the darkest of places, and in each other they found a sense of belonging they had never known before. They were three girls, each broken in her own way, each searching for something they could never have: peace, love, or even just a semblance of safety. But what they found, in the end, was something much darker. They found each other's rage, each other's thirst for vengeance, and together they made a promise: no one would ever hurt them again. And so, their path was set. The town of Pinewood had no idea what was coming. The quiet that had once been Pinewood's defining characteristic was starting to feel like a lie. Beneath the manicured lawns and the gentle sway of the trees, something was festering. The town's flaws had always been hidden under a veneer of politeness, of conformity, but as time passed, they began to seep through the cracks. For years, Pinewood had prided itself on being a sanctuary, a place where no one had to question the norms, where everything was as it should be. But there were wounds in the town that no one wanted to acknowledge. Wounds that were too deep to ignore any longer. It was the beginning of the summer when it all came crashing down, a time when the oppressive heat was enough to make the air feel thick, almost suffocating. The girls, Jasmine, Zuri, and Talia, had been drifting through the days like ghosts, unnoticed by most of the town, keeping to their own world, a world no one else could touch. They had become accustomed to being invisible, to living in the margins of Pinewood's existence. But something was changing. The town had begun to take notice of them, and that attention, while subtle at first, was enough to set something in motion. The first spark came in the form of an event that should have been insignificant, an incident that most people would have forgotten by the end of the day. It began with a confrontation between one of their classmates, a boy named Mason, and a local police officer who had long been a fixture of Pinewood's small community. Officer Garrett was well liked in the town, his clean-cut appearance and affable smile making him a familiar face at school functions and neighborhood block parties. He was a symbol of the town's unshakable sense of order. But the reality was far different from the image he projected. Mason, who had always been a bit of an outsider in Pinewood, awkward, quiet, prone to fits of anger, had crossed paths with Officer Garrett one evening as he was walking home from the local convenience store. Mason had been carrying a bag of chips and a soda, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his oversized hoodie, his head down as if he was trying to disappear into the pavement. He wasn't doing anything wrong, not really, but Officer Garrett had stopped him, asking him to step aside. It wasn't the first time Mason had been stopped by the police, but something about this encounter felt different. Officer Garrett's tone was more commanding, more aggressive, like a predator toying with its prey. The situation escalated quickly. Garrett, who had never been one to tolerate defiance, began questioning Mason's motives, accusing him of loitering, of looking suspicious. The truth was that Mason didn't fit the town's narrow idea of what a good kid should look like. He was quiet, yes, but he had dark skin and wore clothes that didn't belong to the mainstream. His style was eclectic, punk-inspired, a mix of chains and ripped denim that made the older residents nervous. The whispers had started long before the confrontation. Troublemaker, delinquent, bad influence. It didn't matter that Mason wasn't doing anything wrong. It didn't matter that he had never committed a crime. To Officer Garrett, he was an easy target, someone who could be controlled with a few well-chosen words. But Mason wasn't one to back down. Not anymore. The encounter quickly turned hostile, with Garrett escalating his questioning, becoming more accusatory, more insistent. Mason refused to be intimidated, his anger flaring in response to Garrett's condescension. The situation grew heated, and by the time the argument had reached its peak, it was no longer just about a simple stop. It had become about power, about control, about the unspoken assumptions that ran through the veins of Pinewood's residents. The assumptions that said certain people belonged and certain people didn't. Jasmine, Zuri, and Talia had been nearby when the confrontation began, standing on the corner of Maple and Fourth, watching the scene unfold from a distance. At first, they had paid little attention. They were used to the friction that existed between the town's white, conservative population and those who didn't fit the mold. But as the argument continued, something shifted within them. Something primal. Something that had been buried for so long, they could feel the injustice in the air, the weight of it pressing down on their chests. They could see the way Garrett's eyes narrowed as he spoke to Mason, the way his voice dropped lower, more threatening, the way he assumed his authority was something Mason should simply obey, something that should be accepted without question. Zuri's fists clenched at her sides. Jasmine's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and fury. Talia stood there, silent, her gaze distant, but there was something in her eyes, something dark that seemed to pierce through the tent. They had seen it before, the way people like them were treated, the way they were viewed through a lens of suspicion, of fear. It wasn't just about Mason. It was about them too. About everything they had endured, everything they had been forced to survive. And in that moment, it felt like the entire town was complicit in the violence that had shaped their lives, the quiet prejudice that ran deep in the soil of Pinewood. When Garrett's hand moved toward his belt, when his fingers grazed the gun holstered there, it was the tipping point. For the first time, the girls felt a sense of power stir within them, a feeling they hadn't known in years. This was their moment, the moment when the world that had always crushed them beneath its boot would finally be shown for what it was. But it was too late. Before Garrett could make a move, the situation erupted into chaos. A neighbor, an older woman with a sharp tongue and a penchant for gossip, had stepped outside just in time to witness the confrontation. She had seen the girls standing there, watching, and had made an assumption. One that would change everything. She shouted something about troublemakers and the company they keep, her voice thick with the weight of years of unspoken racism. It was the final spark, the one that ignited the fire that would consume the town. Mason, now fully enraged, had shouted back, his words filled with anger, frustration, and desperation. "What the hell is wrong with this town?" he had yelled. "You people act like I'm a criminal just because of the way I look." Officer Garrett had responded with force, shoving Mason to the ground, his boots scraping against the pavement as he tried to hold him down. The scene had become violent in an instant. The older woman had run back inside, slamming the door behind her, the sound of it echoing through the still air. The girls watched from the corner, their breath shallow, their hearts pounding. For the first time, they felt something stir within them, a need to take control of the situation, to stand up and make a statement that would not be ignored. Jasmine had moved first, stepping out from the shadows, her footsteps deliberate, steady. Zuri followed, her fists clenched, her eyes alight with the same fire. Talia lingered for a moment, as if waiting for something, before she too moved toward the confrontation, her presence haunting, like a shadow on the edge of the world. It wasn't the shouting, nor the scuffle, nor the presence of the police that had set the spark. It was something deeper, a recognition, a shared understanding that the power was shifting, that the ground was moving beneath their feet. Pinewood, in all its quiet pride, had become a powder keg, and the girls were the fuse. It was not the first time the town had felt the tremors of unrest. It was not the first time the old wounds had been pulled open, nor the first time the ghosts of Pinewood's past had risen to haunt it. But it was the moment when Jasmine, Zuri, and Talia realized that they could be more than victims of circumstance. They could be something else entirely. They could be the spark that burned it all down. That evening, as the sky bled red with the setting sun, Pinewood was forever changed. The quiet town would never return to the way it had been, and neither would the girls. The night the town of Pinewood would remember forever began like any other. The air was thick with humidity, the heat from the day lingering in the dark, making the stillness feel heavier, more suffocating. In the distance, a dog howled once, its cry echoing through the quiet streets before fading into nothing. The town's peace, the kind that had endured for years, seemed on the brink of being shattered. Though no one could have predicted how, or by whom. It had started with a whisper. a whisper in the shadows, barely audible but full of intent. The girls, Jasmine, Zuri, and Talia, had been preparing for this moment for weeks. It was no longer a question of if they would act, but when. And that night, the night that seemed so ordinary to everyone else, became the night they decided to finally unleash the nightmare that had been festering within them. The events of that evening would carve a mark into the town's history so deep that no one would ever be able to erase it. It began at dusk, when the last rays of the sun had bled out of the sky, leaving behind a sickly purple hue that draped itself over Pinewood like a funeral shroud. The girls had already made their preparations, clothes as dark as the night, weapons hidden under their jackets, sharp, cold, and quiet. They moved like shadows, their steps soundless on the cracked pavement. Their eyes narrowed, their hearts beating in rhythm with the sickening excitement that pulsed through their veins. They were no longer just the girls the town had whispered about. They had become something else entirely. They had become an inevitable force, an executioner in the making. Each of them had a role to play, though none of them spoke the plan aloud. They didn't need to. The bond between them had been forged in pain, in silence, in shared blood and broken dreams. There was no need for words anymore. All that mattered was the task at hand. They knew the town well, perhaps better than anyone else. The sleepy streets, the quiet corners, the safe little neighborhoods. Pinewood was a town of secrets, and for once, the secrets would not remain hidden. The girls knew that fear could not be quelled with kindness, that the rage building inside them could not be extinguished by anything but blood. Their first stop was the home of Officer Garrett, the man who had threatened Mason, the man who had tried to assert his power over someone who no longer feared him. It was not an accident that they started here. Officer Garrett had been a symbol of everything that Pinewood had done wrong, everything that had led to their pain. His authority, his arrogance, his assumption that he could bend the world to his will had made him an easy target. And now, as the girls approached his house, the shadows of the trees stretching long and deep across the lawn, they felt the weight of that power slipping from his grasp. They had watched him for days, learning his routine, studying the moments when he was most vulnerable. He had always been a man who thrived in the daylight, but the dark would be his undoing. They moved swiftly, silently, like wolves circling their prey. Garrett's house sat at the edge of Pinewood, a two-story building with a white picket fence and neatly trimmed hedges. Everything about it screamed order, control, normalcy. It was the picture-perfect American dream, the kind of home everyone envied, but inside, the rot had already begun. The girls had already seen to that. As they approached the door, Talia slipped around the back of the house, blending into the darkness like a shadow. She moved with an eerie precision, the faint rustle of her steps unheard. Jasmine and Zuri, standing at the front, waited, watching for any sign of movement. Garrett had just returned home from his shift, the sounds of his footsteps heavy on the porch. They could hear him inside, the creak of the door, the low hum of the television. He was alone. The plan was simple, quick, efficient, no hesitation. The door swung open, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Garrett, oblivious, began to remove his shoes, his back to the door. But as he turned to hang up his jacket, he saw them. And for the briefest of moments, his face registered surprise. But surprise was not enough to save him. First blow came with a speed that was almost too fast to follow. Zuri was the one who struck, her hand gripping the heavy pipe, the metal meeting Garrett's skull with a sickening thud. His body crumpled in an instant, but not before a final, guttural gasp escaped his throat, as if his very soul were trying to escape the confines of his flesh. The sound was drowned out by the deafening silence that followed. The smell of blood filled the air, hot and metallic. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, like an elastic band pulled too far. Garrett's body collapsed to the floor in a heap, his hand still clutching the jacket he had worn earlier. His eyes, wide and empty, stared blankly at the ceiling, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no meaning here. Only execution. The girls didn't pause, they didn't linger. This was just the beginning. Next came the other houses, those of the prominent citizens. The ones who had never once questioned the system, who had never once stopped to ask why things were the way they were. The ones who had always turned a blind eye to the injustice, who had let their privilege blind them to the suffering that others endured. They had all played their part in keeping the town in chains, and tonight, the chains would be broken. It wasn't long before the town's streets began to stir, the air thick with the scent of impending doom. The girls had already crossed into the next neighborhood, where the houses stood side by side like silent witnesses, like victims waiting to be claimed. They struck quickly, without warning, moving through the houses like a dark storm. Doors were kicked open, and people who had never once thought they would feel fear in Pinewood were suddenly confronted with it in its most raw form. There was no mercy here, no forgiveness. There was only the cold, unflinching execution of a plan that had been years in the making. In one house, the walls were splattered with blood, the floors slick with it, as if the very essence of life had been drained from its inhabitants. In another, the bodies lay in twisted heaps, their faces frozen in expressions of horror, their eyes wide in disbelief. The girls moved from room to room, never pausing, never faltering. There was no panic in their movements, no second thoughts. Just the cold certainty that this was necessary, that this was the only way to rid the town of its rot. As the night wore on, the town of Pinewood began to suffocate under the weight of its own darkness. The sirens were slow to come, their wail distant, muffled by the trees and the buildings. By the time they did, it was already too late. The blood was already spilled, and the girls were already gone, leaving behind only carnage and the unmistakable echo of their presence. The town would never be the same. When the sun rose the next morning, it found Pinewood unrecognizable. The streets, once clean and quiet, were now stained with the aftermath of the execution. The houses, those proud symbols of suburban perfection, were now nothing more than graves. Empty, broken, haunted. The blood, dark and sticky on the ground, would remain as a permanent reminder of the night the town's sins were washed away. And the girls were gone, slipping back into the shadows, their names whispered with fear and reverence in the empty streets. But their mark would stay, embedded in the walls of the town, in the minds of those who had survived. Pinewood had been chosen. And now, nothing would ever be the same. The morning after the massacre, Pinewood was a town suffocating under an eerie, heavy silence. The sun, pale and unrelenting, rose over the scene of unimaginable horror, casting long, grotesque shadows over the streets that had once seemed so ordinary. The blood that stained the roads and the front steps of the houses was dark and sticky, a testament to the brutality that had unfolded under cover of darkness. The air was thick, like the town itself was holding its breath, unwilling to exhale the truth of what had happened. By the time the first responders arrived, half dazed, their eyes wide and hollow from the shock of the night, the scene was beyond belief. The sirens had wailed all the way through Pinewood, a sound that seemed too sharp, too raw for such a quiet place. The coroner, when he finally arrived, was the first to speak the unspeakable. The brutality of the killings was unprecedented. Multiple victims. Blood everywhere, no sign of a struggle. It was as if something had risen from the depths of Pinewood's soul, something dark, something that had been waiting for years to break free. The victims, 25 in total, had been chosen with a precision that unnerved even the most seasoned investigators. It wasn't random. It wasn't just violence for the sake of violence. The girls had known who they were going after. Each one a symbol of the town's complicity, its unchecked privilege, its hidden rot. From Officer Garrett, who had harassed Mason, to the well-to-do families who had thrived in ignorance of the pain around them. Each victim had a part to play in the story of Pinewood's unspoken sins. The town was paralyzed by fear. No one could explain how such a thing could happen, and no one wanted to believe it. People whispered behind closed doors, the news spreading like a disease. The investigation began immediately, but there was little to go on. No witnesses had seen the attackers. No security footage. No clear motives beyond the blood-soaked horror of the night. It was as if the perpetrators had evaporated into thin air. Detective Harold McKinney was the one called to oversee the investigation. He was a man who had lived in Pinewood for his entire life, a man who knew the town's secrets like the back of his hand. But as he stepped into the carnage, his breath caught in his throat. He had never seen anything like this. Not in his years of service, not in his darkest nightmares. There was no order to it, no sense of control. The detective scanned the room, his eyes darting from one mangled corpse to another. The brutality of it gnawed at him. This wasn't the work of a stranger. This wasn't random violence. Someone had carefully planned this. Someone who knew Pinewood like the back of their hand, who understood its people and its vulnerabilities. The realization hit him like a slap to the face. The killer, or killers, had been there all along. The town's first instinct was denial. The wealthy families of Pinewood, those who had always considered themselves insulated from the problems of the outside world, were the first to circle their wagons. They held meetings in their pristine living rooms, talked in hushed tones behind closed doors, all while trying to maintain an air of control. Their children had been at the heart of this nightmare. The victims were all connected to the town's elite, people of power, influence, and privilege. But no one wanted to believe it. The idea that their own could be capable of such horrific acts was too much for them to bear. The first suspects were obvious. Anyone with a motive, anyone with a history of violence, anyone who had been at the scene. But there were no clear leads. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. The town was too tight-knit, too small for anything to go unnoticed. And yet, the silence that followed the massacre was absolute. As the days passed, Detective McKinney began to focus his attention on the three girls. Jasmine, Zuri, and Talia had been quiet since the massacre. Too quiet, some thought. They had no alibis for the night in question, and the more the detective dug, the more he realized that they had all been in the town during the massacre. The more he dug, the more he discovered that they had been on the periphery of every important event in the girls' lives. Every bit of trauma, every broken family, every whisper of violence. It didn't take long for McKinney to piece together the disturbing truth. These girls had been living with a darkness far deeper than anyone could have guessed. But still, there were no clear answers. The girls were too young to have carried out such a horrific act, and yet the suspicion surrounding them grew. People began to look at them differently. The girls, once ignored by most, now became the center of every conversation. Parents warned their children to stay away from them. Teachers gave them wary glances, and the town's residents murmured behind their hands, as if they could will the truth into existence. No one had proof, but everyone was sure they knew who was responsible. The way Jasmine carried herself, the way Zuri's eyes seemed to burn with unspoken rage, the cold, emotionless way Talia had moved. Everything about them screamed guilt. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the girls were more than just suspects. They were the town's scapegoats, its outcasts, its darkest reflection. The townspeople began to draw connections where there were none. They were looking for someone to blame, someone to offer up as the embodiment of the horror that had swept through their lives. But the truth was more complicated. Detective McKinney felt a strange pull towards the girls, a sense that the answers lay hidden somewhere beneath their eyes, somewhere behind their hardened exteriors. They were not innocent, not in the traditional sense, but neither were they the monsters the town imagined them to be. The detective couldn't shake the thought that Pinewood, in its pursuit of normalcy and order, had built the very creatures who now haunted it. As the weeks wore on, the town of Pinewood became a place of suspicion, a town where neighbors no longer spoke to each other, where every interaction felt loaded with a sense of impending violence. The investigation stalled, the pieces of the puzzle scattered, just out of reach. The girls remained silent, their faces unreadable, their actions ambiguous. But in their silence, they were guilty in the eyes of everyone who had ever turned a blind eye. The town was fractured, no longer a place of comfort, but a place of tension, of fear. And then, one evening, when the town was at its most quiet, a letter arrived. It was unsigned, its contents vague but chilling. It was a confession, or perhaps a warning. It spoke of pain, of revenge, of a reckoning that had been a long time coming. It hinted at the girls but never named them directly. It suggested that the town's rot had been festering for years, and the bloodshed was merely the beginning. The town, terrified and confused, had no idea what would come next. As the days bled into each other, the town of Pinewood was held in a vice of mounting terror. The investigation had come to a standstill, and suspicion hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating everyone beneath it. But beneath the tension, something darker was stirring. The truth, the real truth, had never been far. The girls had woven their silence like a shroud, but now it was time for it to unravel. It came late one evening, when the town's restless breath was almost audible. Detective McKinney, driven by an uneasy feeling, had returned to the remains of Officer Garrett's house, the place where it all began. He stood there, staring at the wreckage, his mind a cacophony of unanswered questions. Something was missing. Then, amidst the wreckage, something caught his eye. A scrap of paper, so small it could have been overlooked, but the handwriting was unmistakable. A name, a date, a map. A chilling promise. The pieces fell together all at once, as though the walls between the past and the present had cracked open. The girls had been orchestrating this all along. They weren't just victims, they had been the executioners from the start. Their pain, their rage, had festered for years, and this night, this blood-soaked night, had been the inevitable reckoning. They had known the town's darkest secrets, had become its very shadow, and in the end, it wasn't about vengeance, it was about cleansing. The truth, cold and unforgiving, shattered the silence. The girls had become both judge and executioner. They had unleashed the nightmare Pinewood had buried for so long.